Hello, Daniel Guiney here again. This is my third video reflection on my chosen walks for this week. And for this one, I'll talk briefly about faith. I don't attempt to think for 1 second that I will present a conclusive response to this. It's simply too huge a topic. Instead, I'll simply offer my own synthesis. After all, if the world entire has been arguing over faith as a way of knowledge, it would be foolish to think I can offer something holistic here. But I do, however, intend to break it down in the same format as my other videos to help me reflect individually on faith as a way of knowing. And so I hope this again provides some food for thought. So the 3 sections will be 1, why I chose this walk, 2, how faith affects knowledge, and 3, some possible future implications. So first of all, why I chose this walk. Well, there are 2 reasons really, and I'll try and fuse them together. I was raised a Roman Catholic into an Irish family, had my baptism, first communion, my confirmation. I've even been given the last rites. But were I born in ancient Rome, I'd probably have worshipped Jupiter rather than my Judeo-Christian god. Or in ancient Greece, maybe Apollo or Zeus. If I were a Viking, maybe Thor or Wotan. So I want to consider faith as a walk in my own context. I also spent some very enjoyable time living out in Cairo, where morning prayers were the norm, and you would regularly walk past people kneeling on the street declaring there is only one God and Allah is his messenger in Arabic. And secondly, as a history teacher, I'm very familiar with the history of faith, and I felt relatively secure in my subject knowledge discussing this from the Crusades through to medieval pogroms, the blood libel, through to religion being forced upon indigenous peoples, such as in a country that I really enjoy visiting, which is the Philippines. There's that old Desmond Tutu quote, isn't there, about when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible, we had the land. We closed our eyes. When we opened them up, we had the Bible and they had the land. So religion and its history are fascinating. Other things, witchcraft and burnings were fueled by religiosity. The Scopes monkey trial is something I teach at IGCSE. It was the Dutch Reformed Church that created the foundations for South African apartheid. And more recently, in Nazi Germany, it's reported that 50 to 60% of the Waffen SS were practicing theists. And a personal interest of mine, looking at Emperor Hirohito in Japan, he said he was a god, and people believed that. In Okinawa, children would be rolled by their parents in carpets under tanks with bombs attached to them. Japanese kamikaze pilots would fly into American ships, all in the name of religion. And Karl Marx, of course, famously termed it the opium of the masses. So my 2 reasons really are, 1, being raised a Roman Catholic, and 2, having a fair knowledge of the history of religion. And to combine these 2 together, I've taught history in religious schools across the world, in places like Singapore and in the UK. So that's why I'm interested to explore this walk with you today. Now the difficult bit of actually exploring faith as a way of knowing. So this is section 2. Well, there appear crudely to be 2 schools of thought, or at least 2 camps. On the one hand, there are those who have faith in a grand designer or a god, and they believe faith is a legitimate way of knowing. And then there are those people such as Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Ricky Gervais who argue that faith is actually an obstacle to knowing and that it hinders our efforts to get to the truth. So what I'm going to do here is discuss the 2 together and hope that I do it some kind of justice and it promotes some stimulation of discussion out there. So firstly, if we're looking at knowledge, I guess the big question for me is, why are we here? I don't think there's a bigger question than that, or how are we here? So the question of design is crucial for this walk. Most scientists now believe in the Big Bang Theory, the idea that there was a random collision of particles. Again, I'm sure there are lots of science teachers out there who can tell me more about this. But the idea that 13 billion years ago the universe came about, um, whereas theists believe in a great designer, someone who is transcendent, an intelligent mind, and a personal, sentient creator. Um, and this is a teleological argument. In other words, it's about purpose rather than cause. And you often see the idea that if an Aborigine found a watch on a beach, he would assume that this device, this creation, is so complicated and intricate. Think of all the cogs and the wheels and the movement and the timing and the mathematics, that he would have to assume this must be designed. It's not just a rock that's washed up. And likewise, people who do believe in a great creator argue that the planetary movements, the maths, the beauty of the cosmos means that it can't be randomly ordered. It's an infinite world ensemble, and therefore must be intelligently designed. Now, if we accept that as a way of knowing, it invites the question, well, who designed the designer? Okay, that was an argument given by Christopher Hitchens. And moreover, Christopher Hitchens points out, well, actually the Andromeda galaxy is on a collision course with us, and one day our world will be destroyed. There'll be darkness, nothing, the sun will burn us to a crisp. And so if we do accept that it's been intelligently designed by a god, well, that's not a very good design because he's designing us to destroy us. Also, we're not designed in the sense of being mechanisms. We're not watches. We're not, we do change over time. And for me, evolution has evidence. I've got a little baby girl at home at the moment, and she has a really strong grip, as all babies do. And that's because we used to be monkeys, and when we were babies, we practiced hanging on trees. So for me, the arguments about intelligent design lack the evidence of the Big Bang and evolution theories. So for me, I would argue here that in terms of the question of design, that religion as a way of knowing hinders knowledge. Secondly, though, there's an interesting argument by Epicurus about omniscience and omnipotence. In other words, if a god is all-powerful, he can't be all-loving. And if he's all-loving, he can't be all-powerful. The British TV personality Stephen Fry, in an interview with Irish TV network RTE, famously blasted his interviewer when he was asked what he would say to God if God appeared. And Stephen Fry said that God must be evil if, in fact, he does exist as a sentient being. Bone cancer in children was one example he cites, as are the parasites whose sole purpose on this universe is to eat into our eyes. What kind of a god would do such a thing? You could come up with many more examples. The Fritzl case in Germany, where a daughter was repeatedly raped by her own father over a 25-year period of captivity in a cellar, where she had his children and so on. These are real horrors, and I guess the question is, and Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about this also on YouTube, if a god is all-loving, then surely he could have stopped that, would have stopped that. Stephen Fry goes on to say that, well, actually, if he worshipped the 12 Greek gods, it would be more understandable because they didn't declare themselves to be all-loving. So his analysis argues, I think, against God being a reasonable way of knowing. St. Augustine came up with the concept of limbo, the idea that completely innocent, beautiful little babies, if they're not baptized, can't enter the kingdom of heaven, can't enjoy the afterlife, simply because they're not a member of a club. So I think the first 2 points really about the question of design and also all-powerful versus all-loving suggest to me that actually religion is an obstacle to knowledge. But it's also, and this is a really important point, thirdly, it's worth considering religious texts and where we get our knowledge from. If we consider these, now I'm going to focus heavily on Catholicism because it's probably the area that I know best. But Catholics believe that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. They believe he healed Legion by forcing demons to leave his body and enter pigs, who then the herd went on to drown themselves. They also believe he walked on water, and that he bid Peter to do the same, with the words, "Wherefore didst thou doubt?" Um, and obviously, this is not even considering the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. All of these seem fairly far-fetched in terms of knowledge. And if I change the religion, I could argue that Muslims believed Muhammad flew on a winged horse to the moon 1,400 years ago. So their forms of knowledge, or they're woks really. Religions are wok, and those are the knowledge. But can I disprove any of that? Well, science suggests that those theories are out there, to say the least. But there are some who would argue against that, and they would say, well, religion has evolved, and we should not judge modern faith by events or scriptures written thousands of years ago, but we should judge it by what religion is today. The MP for Dover and famous xenophobe Anne Widdecombe makes this point and says, well, we can't judge modern religion by the values of the medieval period when torture and horrible things were kind of a way of life. But again, my issue with this is that there are those people who still believe in the scriptures today. Mother Teresa, becoming a saint, could not become a saint unless she had performed a miracle. And so there was a woman, I think in Albania, who said she held a coin to her chest to get rid of a tumour. It's basically just not true. But the modern world is acting on ancient scriptures as if it's still very applicable. So for me, again, that's a problem with the knowledge. Also, when I lived in Cairo, I think it was estimated that 95% of girls in Egypt experience FGM, female genital mutilation, which is to me is a violent crime. But that's done in the name of religion. Also in the Bible, lots of talk of fire and brimstone, and in Samuel 1:15:3, Google tells me there's the famous call to kill the Amalekites. Now again, as a way of knowing, if you were to follow the Bible to the letter, it's calling for people to commit murder, which isn't very nice. But then there are people who question the language sometimes used and the translations of religious texts. So the Bible, for example, has gone from Hebrew to Greek to English with the modern King James Bible, and it's estimated there are up to 27,000 errors in the translations. So walking on water may have been something different, and a famous example from Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, is the kingdom of God is within you. And apparently this is a mistranslation from the Hebrew. And again, these mistranslations can lead to a change in people actively acting on false knowledge. But again, in defense of religion and faith as a way of knowing, some people argue that religion does give us moral knowledge. After all, where would we be without religious morality? Lions commit infanticide, and rape is common in the animal kingdom. Black widow spiders notoriously eat their partners. So it's the idea that religion gives us some moral knowledge that we need. Catholic charities give billions of dollars annually, more than any single nation, to good causes. And there are excellent agencies like CAFOD. There are churches in London that go around feeding the homeless. And when I went to my Catholic school in Birmingham in the UK, it was an annual thing to prepare hampers for the elderly and the vulnerable in winter. But does it require faith to impart such moral knowledge? I don't think it does. Pope Pius the 12th, I think, signed the first real agreement with the Nazis, the Reichskonkordat, and from there on indulged in real complicity throughout the entire Holocaust. And the parallels, this is history teacher of me going off on one, between the two remain uncanny, right down to the Hakenkreuz, or the hooked cross of the swastika. You could compare Mein Kampf as a effectively biblical text with Holy Scriptures. You've got strong, powerful leaders at the top. You've got the Führer on the one hand and the Pope on the other, kind of messiahs really. And even the kind of call for procession and uniforms and rallies, an awful lot of comparisons between religious bodies and large groups like the Nazis. I mentioned earlier that 50 to 60% of the Waffen SS were practicing theists. And again, Christopher Hitchens, seeing some of his stuff here, said that the Nazis sang for Hitler every day on his birthday. And also Christopher Hitchens points out that the only Nazi ever excommunicated by the church was Joseph Goebbels, and that was nothing to do with his attacks on and persecutions on minority groups. It was because his wife was a divorced Protestant. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church, going back to the blood libel. Look at, if you research Hugh of Lincoln or William of Norwich, the idea that Jews were going around parts of England killing children, for Gentile children, for their blood for Passover. Also through to the charge of deicide, that they were responsible for the death of Jesus. There are many concentration camps in the Second World War, but there were 6 designed exclusively for killing, and many of the 6 million Jews who died in these camps, and was famous, which is probably Auschwitz, and all 6 of those are in Poland, which is a predominantly Catholic country. My question is all of this a coincidence? Pope Ratzinger was a member of the Hitler Youth, as were many over the age of 12, and that's not exceptional in itself, but it does detract from the argument of papal infallibility, as does Pope Francis famously swiping at someone who's trying to grab him pretty recently. So for me, it doesn't necessarily lead or make sense that religion gives us moral knowledge on its own, although it can do. And one could say the same for other faiths too. And I think what makes this even more dangerous in the modern world is, whereas the Bible, 2,000 however many years old it is, tells us to kill the Amalekites, to regimes like Iran, which is a theocracy, which is acquiring nuclear weapons. Likewise, you could look at the church's view on contraception and argue that actually it has some moral obligation there, and that it's helping people to die from AIDS just because of its views on contraception from an old religious text. So as a way of knowing, that's again something I would take umbrage with, as is the Catholic Church's views on homosexuality. I think they promote fear and violence. And famously, I think there was a movie made about it recently, Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, who died recently, was involved in covering up paedophilia in the Catholic Church for 18 years in Boston, in America. He was moving priests who were paedophiles from parish to parish, and their victims weren't aware of this. So, does it give us moral knowledge? I would argue not. So I think really what I've argued so far is that, having explored some of the ways that people try to acquire knowledge through faith, I think for me at least, there's a stronger argument that actually faith obscures our knowledge. So final section, number 3, some possible future reflections. Again, this is where I get my crystal ball out really. I don't think religion is going away in my lifetime. I think there are lots of good things about religion as well, but I argue here that it is an obstacle to knowledge. Richard Dawkins compares removing it to being harder to eradicate than smallpox. Ricky Gervais, one of my favourite comedians, who famously ended the Golden Globes award ceremony with the line, "Thank God for making me an atheist," points out in a TV show with Catholic host Stephen Colbert, who's also one of my TV heroes, that there have been over 3,000 gods worshipped over time, and he therefore doesn't believe in only one more god than himself. So certainly, unless you believe in all the gods, there is a question over who is the real creator. And another good point made by Ricky Gervais is that if all religious and scientific texts were destroyed, if we had no religious knowledge and no scientific knowledge, in a few thousand years, the scientific ones would be rewritten pretty much as they were, and he argues that the religious ones would not. So, to conclude, Richard Dawkins describes religion as a pernicious distraction from true education. And I think, having explored some of the key areas, that would be my take on faith as a way of knowing as well. But I found it really interesting. I found there was probably the biggest difficulty I had in putting this video together was there's so much out there that it's hard to get your head around the sheer volume of opinions on the matter. So I hope that I've contributed something to this forum that will invite some discussion, and I welcome your thoughts on faith as a way of knowing. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.